Get ready to have your understanding of one of the most well-known chapters in the Bible completely turned upside down. You've heard it before, Genesis 1, the ultimate story of creation, where in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. But what if everything we thought we knew about this chapter was incomplete? What if I told you that Genesis 1 isn't just a historical account of the world's formation, but rather an ancient cosmological narrative that reflects the way people long ago viewed the universe? It's not a scientific description of how matter came to be, but something far more complex and meaningful. To truly comprehend Genesis 1, we have to step out of our modern worldview and step into the mindset of the ancient Israelites. These were people who didn't have the tools or knowledge we have today: no telescopes, no satellites, no science journals. Their perception of the universe was vastly different. They imagined the earth as a flat expanse with a solid dome of sky above, holding back chaotic waters. They believed the heavens had windows that opened to let rain through, and beneath the earth was the underworld, surrounded by deep, dark waters. Everything in their universe had its designated place and purpose. Here's the fascinating part. Genesis 1 is not the only creation story from the ancient world. The Babylonians, the Sumerians, and the Egyptians all had their own creation myths, and they are eerily similar to what we see in Genesis. Consider the Babylonian myth, Enuma Elish. In this story, the god Marduk defeats the sea goddess Tiamat and splits her body in two, creating the heavens and the earth. Sounds familiar, right? Genesis 1:6-7 says, "And God said, 'Let there be a vault between the waters to separate water from water.' So God made the vault and separated the water under the vault from the water above it." Both stories involve separating waters to establish cosmic order. This motive of dividing chaotic waters to bring about order isn't unique to the Bible. It's an ancient theme that appears across multiple cultures, and Genesis 1 is tapping into that shared cosmological framework. This means Genesis 1 is more of a stylized, poetic narrative than a literal step-by-step description of how the physical universe came into being. One of the most significant clues to this interpretation lies in the Hebrew word for create, bara. Contrary to popular belief, bara isn't primarily about material creation. Instead, it's about assigning roles, functions, and order. In the ancient world, creation wasn't about constructing objects out of nothing. It was about turning chaos into a functional system. So when Genesis says, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth," it's not necessarily referring to the formation of physical matter. It's describing the establishment of order from chaos, separating light from darkness, water from land, and giving each thing its place and purpose in the cosmos. One scholar who has championed this interpretation is John H. Walton, whose book The Lost World of Genesis 1 has revolutionized how we understand this ancient text. Walton argues that ancient peoples weren't concerned with material origins like we are today. They focused on the functionality of the cosmos, questions like, why does the sun rise and set? Or what is the meaning behind the cycles of nature? Genesis 1 provides answers to these questions, not to modern inquiries about atoms, galaxies, or the Big Bang. It's also crucial to consider the historical context in which Genesis 1 was written. The Israelites were living amidst powerful empires: Babylon, Egypt, and Assyria, all of which had their own creation myths. The Israelites were undoubtedly influenced by these neighboring cultures. But here's the twist. Genesis 1 takes these familiar mythological ideas and radically transforms them. Unlike the chaotic, violent creation myths of other cultures where gods battle for dominance, Genesis 1 presents a very different story. There's no divine war, no cosmic conflict. Instead, there's one God who speaks, and through his word, order is effortlessly brought into existence. Now, let's go back to the 6th century BCE, during the Babylonian exile. The Israelites were captives in Babylon, a city full of temples to gods like Marduk and Ishtar. In this hostile environment, the Israelites' faith was under immense pressure. Genesis 1 wasn't just a story about how the world began, it was a powerful theological statement. It proclaimed that their God wasn't like the other gods who had to fight chaos. Their God was sovereign, supreme, and could bring order simply by speaking. This was a direct challenge to the chaotic, warring gods of Babylon. So what does all this mean for us today? Genesis 1 isn't trying to give us a modern scientific account of the universe's origins. It's a profound, ancient text that reflects the worldview of the Israelites and the cultures that surrounded them. It's a story about bringing order to chaos, assigning purpose to the cosmos, and declaring that one God, not many, rules over it all. And that is a far deeper and more meaningful understanding than the simplistic interpretation many of us were taught. Now that we've established that Genesis 1 isn't some step-by-step guide to building the universe, let's dig into one of the most intriguing phrases in the entire creation story, Tohu wa Bohu. You've probably heard it translated as formless and void, describing the state of the earth before God steps in and organizes things. But what does that even mean? And is it really as simple as the earth was empty and needed filling? First off, we need to talk about what Tohu wa Bohu would have meant to the ancient Hebrews who wrote this text. This is one of those Hebrew phrases that doesn't translate cleanly into English. It's not like the writers were saying, hey, the earth was just a blank canvas, ready for God to get to work. No, it's deeper than that. In Hebrew, Tohu carries the sense of chaos or disorder, something like a wasteland or wilderness, but with a chaotic edge. It's not just empty but wild, completely uninhabitable and disordered. As for Bohu, well, that word's even trickier. It shows up only a couple of times in the entire Bible and always right next to Tohu, almost as if they're a set. Most scholars agree it emphasizes the emptiness and futility of the scene. So we're talking about a world that's not just shapeless but chaotic, wild, and essentially pointless until God steps in. Now, here's where it gets interesting. This description isn't unique to the Bible. In fact, the whole idea of a chaotic, unordered state at the beginning of time pops up in other ancient texts, especially in the creation myths of the surrounding cultures. The Babylonians, for example, believed that before creation there was only this primeval chaos, symbolized by the goddess Tiamat, the embodiment of the untamed sea. Sound familiar? Like we talked about before, Genesis 1 seems to be riffing off this idea of chaos, except the Bible gives it a new twist. There's no big cosmic battle, no gods warring it out to bring the universe into being. In Genesis, chaos is there, but God just calmly speaks into the chaos. It's almost like the writers of Genesis were saying, we've seen those Babylonian stories, but our God doesn't need to fight to create. He just commands and the chaos falls in line. And here's another thing. When we read formless and void, we usually think it means creation from nothing, what theologians call ex nihilo. But here's where the real controversy comes in. Genesis 1, verse 2, doesn't actually say that God created the world out of nothing. What it says is that there was already something, a chaotic, formless mess that God brought order to. So rather than saying God made everything from scratch, it's more like God took this wild, disordered state and started organizing it. This is a huge shift in how people usually read the text, especially if you've grown up thinking of God snapping his fingers and creating matter out of thin air. Now, Tohu wa Bohu also challenges another big assumption that the creation story is linear. A lot of people imagine Genesis 1 as a simple timeline, day 1, day 2, day 3, and so on. But if you look closely at how the ancient Hebrews might have understood it, it's more like God is setting up domains and then filling them. Days 1 through 3, he's creating realms, light and dark, sky and water, land and sea. Then in days 4 through 6, he populates those realms, sun and moon, birds and fish, animals and humans. So what's happening in Tohu wa Bohu is more about function than about building something from scratch. It's not that the earth was just sitting there like a blank sheet of paper waiting to be filled. It's that the earth was chaotic, non-functional, and God came in to give it purpose. There's also a lot of debate among scholars about what this chaotic state really represented. Some think it's symbolic of a world that's not yet suitable for human life, while others suggest it's a metaphor for moral and spiritual disorder. And let's not forget the ancient Israelites themselves. They had spent centuries surrounded by desert wastelands and chaotic seas. They knew chaos intimately. To them, Tohu Bohu wasn't just about physical emptiness. It was a spiritual and existential concept. It represented a world that was inhospitable to life, not just because it lacked form, but because it lacked purpose, direction, and order. The real creation then wasn't just the forming of physical things. It was God stepping in to bring meaning to a meaningless state. And don't think for a second that this idea of chaos before creation ends in Genesis 1. Later, in books like Isaiah, we see Tohu being used to describe desolation and judgment. It's not just a one-time deal. The concept of Tohu Bohu became a powerful image throughout Hebrew scripture for describing a world that's lost its way, a world that's reverted to chaos because of disobedience or sin. Now we need to dig deeper into another curious detail that often gets overlooked, the name of God used in Genesis 1, Elohim. So now here's where things get really interesting. The word Elohim is actually plural in Hebrew. If you heard that right, plural. That's strange, right? We're taught from a young age that the God of the Bible is one God, and yet here we are with this plural word used to describe him. What's going on? What's this even on? First, let's clear one thing up. Elohim doesn't mean there are multiple gods involved in the creation story. The Hebrew Bible is very clear on that there's only one God. But the fact that Elohim is plural raises some fascinating questions about how the ancient Israelites viewed God and how they understood his role in creation. It's almost like a subtle nod to something bigger happening behind the scenes, something that's not entirely explained in Genesis 1, but is there nonetheless. The use of Elohim ties directly into the ancient Near Eastern context. You see, in the cultures surrounding Israel, places like Canaan, Egypt, and Babylon, the sky was crowded with gods. You had gods for the sun, the moon, the rivers, the sea, fertility, war, you name it. Every realm of existence had its own deity or deities managing it, and creation was often seen as the work of many gods working together, each playing a specific role in shaping the universe. By using Elohim, Genesis 1 seems to be pushing back against that worldview. Instead of multiple gods duking it out or cooperating to create the world, one God, Elohim, takes care of everything. There's no divine council making decisions, no factions vying for control. There's just one supreme being, calmly bringing order to the universe. This might sound subtle, but it's a huge theological shift. The ancient Israelites were making a bold statement. Our God is powerful enough to do it all by himself. And yet, even though Elohim is used in the plural form, the verbs and actions in the Hebrew text remain singular. It's like the Bible is saying, yeah, we know Elohim is plural, but this isn't about multiple gods. This is about one God who is so powerful. His name reflects the fullness of his power, even if it's plural. And some scholars have suggested that this plural form reflects something like a majestic plural, a way of emphasizing God's ultimate authority and grandeur. It's not just any God, it's the God. But the plot thickens even more when you realize that the concept of Elohim could also reflect the divine council imagery that pops up later in the Bible. Ever heard of Psalm 82? In that passage, Elohim is portrayed as the head of a divine council where God presides over lesser divine beings or angels. It's a bit like a heavenly boardroom meeting, but with God as the CEO. Some scholars argue that the plural form of Elohim in Genesis 1 might hint at this ancient idea that there's one supreme God, but he's not alone in the spiritual realm. Now, this doesn't mean there were multiple creators in Genesis 1, but it does open up an interesting perspective. And maybe, just maybe, the ancient Israelites had a more nuanced view of the spiritual world than we often give them credit for. They weren't strict monotheists right from the start. Their understanding of God evolved over time. In the earliest days of Israelite religion, they may have believed in other spiritual beings, lesser gods, or angels who served under the supreme Elohim. And this gets even more intriguing when you start looking at the surrounding cultures. In Canaanite religion, there was a high god named El who ruled over a divine council made up of lesser gods. including the storm god Baal. Some scholars believe that the Israelites adopted some of this language but redefined it to fit their belief in one true God. So when they use Elohim in Genesis 1, they might be tapping into this broader cultural framework but flipping the script. And instead of many gods working together, you have one God whose power is unmatched, even if his name still echoes that ancient plural form. But here's the kicker. When we read Elohim in Genesis 1, we're not just seeing a relic of Israel's polytheistic neighbors. We're seeing an evolution in theology. It's like the Bible is subtly hinting at the complexity of God's nature, something that would become more fully developed in later scriptures. While the Israelites believed in one God, they were also grappling with the idea that God's presence and power were bigger, more expansive, and more complex than they could fully understand. So Elohim, a plural name, points to the fullness, the majesty, and the all-encompassing nature of this one God who stands above all creation. Now let's take it one step further and talk about how Genesis 1 isn't really about material creation at all. It's about assigning function and purpose. This might sound strange at first, but stick with me because it's a game changer. To really get this, you need to understand how ancient people thought about the world. In modern times, we're obsessed with what things are made of, the material stuff. But we want to know how things came to exist physically. But in the ancient world, that wasn't their primary concern. Well, they weren't asking, how did God create atoms and molecules? They were asking, what's the purpose of the sun, the moon, the animals, and us? Their idea of creation wasn't focused on material origins, but on functional origins. It's less about what something is and more about what something is for. This idea comes through clearly in John Walton's work, specifically in his book, The Lost World of Genesis 1. He argues that in Genesis 1, God isn't so much creating stuff as he is establishing functions. Take light, for example. When God says, "Let there be light," he's not necessarily creating photons out of nothing. Instead, he's assigning the function of light, setting it in its role to govern day and night. And when he creates the sun and moon on the fourth day, he's giving them the function of marking time. It's not just about their physical presence in the sky, it's about what they do. You can see this pattern throughout Genesis 1. God separates the waters and creates the sky, not just as physical spaces, but as domains with specific roles. The land is separated from the sea, but it's not just dirt and water. The land's function is to produce vegetation, and the sea's function is to be filled with living creatures. The story is about ordering the cosmos in a way that everything has its proper place and role. This shift from thinking about material creation to functional creation turns the whole Genesis narrative on its head. And we've been conditioned to think of creation in terms of God making things: the earth, the sky, animals, humans. But the ancient audience would have been more focused on the idea that God is bringing order and purpose to everything. It's not about making something from nothing, it's about taking the chaotic, unordered state and giving it meaning. Take the creation of humanity, for instance. When God creates Adam and Eve, he doesn't just make physical beings. He assigns them a function to rule over the earth, to tend to it, and to multiply. Humanity's purpose is central to the creation story. We're not just here as another part of the physical world, we've been given a specific role within God's ordered cosmos. And here's where it all comes together with what we've already discussed. Remember how we talked about Tohu, Bohu representing disorder and chaos? Well, God's act of creation in Genesis 1 is about giving everything a place and a purpose, taking that chaos and making it functional. Each day of creation isn't just about making more things, it's about organizing the universe into a coherent, purposeful system where every element has a job to do. Even the structure of the creation narrative reflects this idea of functional order. In the first 3 days, God creates domains: day and night, sky and water, land and vegetation. Then in the next 3 days, he fills those domains with their functionaries: the sun and moon to govern day and night, birds and fish to fill the sky and sea, animals and humans to inhabit the land. It's a structured, ordered process of function assignment, not a chaotic burst of material creation. And this brings us to a key point. When we understand Genesis 1 as a story of functional creation, it stops being about how the world was made in a physical sense and starts being about why the world exists in the way it does. The ancient audience didn't care about whether the earth was 6,000 years old or billions of years old. What mattered to them was purpose. Why does the sun rise? What's the point of the stars? Why do humans exist? Genesis 1 answers those questions by showing a God who assigns purpose in order to a chaotic, meaningless world. Now, this doesn't mean that the material world wasn't important. Of course it was. But the focus of Genesis 1 is much more about establishing roles than about describing the mechanics of physical creation. It's not a science textbook, it's a cosmic declaration of purpose. God's creating isn't about things, it's about functions. The world isn't just a bunch of random stuff thrown together, it's an ordered system, and everything within it has a role to play. All right, we've covered some groundbreaking ideas about how Genesis 1 is really about bringing order and assigning functions. But what if I told you this story is also directly connected to a pivotal moment in Israel's history? Yep, we're talking about the Babylonian exile, a period of deep crisis for the Israelites that shaped much of how they understood their relationship with God and the world around them. And Genesis 1? It wasn't just some random story written in a vacuum. It was shaped by this historical context, especially as a response to the dominant culture they found themselves in Babylon. Let's rewind to the 6th century BCE. The Israelites had been conquered by the Babylonians, their temple destroyed, and many of them were dragged off into exile. They were in a foreign land surrounded by foreign gods, and their whole sense of identity was being threatened. In the midst of this, they were being exposed to Babylonian myths, especially their creation story, the Enuma Elish. This myth was everywhere in Babylon, probably even recited during their religious festivals. The Enuma Elish tells the story of the god Marduk, who defeats the chaotic sea goddess Tiamat and splits her body in half to create the heavens and the earth. Creation in this story comes out of a violent battle between gods, with Marduk reigning supreme. Now think about how that would have hit the Israelites, who believed in one all-powerful God who didn't need to fight or struggle to create the universe. They're sitting there in exile, hearing this story about a pantheon of gods clashing in chaotic warfare to bring the world into being, and it doesn't line up with what they know about their God, Yahweh. So what happens? Genesis 1 starts to take shape as a direct response to this Babylonian worldview. It's like the writers of Genesis were saying, you've got this story of gods fighting and chaos ruling, but our God doesn't operate like that. In the Enuma Elish, the world is born out of violence. Marduk has to conquer chaos, and creation is a result of war. But look at Genesis 1, there's no violence. There's no struggle. God doesn't battle with the forces of chaos, he simply speaks and order happens. Let there be light, and there it is. This isn't just a theological statement, it's a political one. Genesis 1 is saying, our God is supreme. He doesn't need to fight to establish his rule. It's a direct contradiction to the Babylonian myth, where power is asserted through conquest. The structure of Genesis 1 also contrasts with the Babylonian myth. The Enuma Elish is all about Marduk consolidating power among the gods, positioning himself as the king of the divine council. It's filled with drama, divine politics, and, as we said, a lot of violence. But in Genesis 1, Elohim is in complete control from the start. He's not part of a divine council, he is the council. He's not negotiating or fighting for his place. He simply is, and the world responds to his word. Light appears, waters are divided, dry land forms, and life begins to thrive, all because God spoke. There's no need for divine warfare because there's no competition. So why is this such a big deal? Because at its core, Genesis 1 isn't just a story about how the world came to be, it's about who has the power. For the Israelites in exile, this was more than just theological trivia. They were living under Babylonian rule, a kingdom that saw Marduk as the ultimate deity, and they were hearing stories about how the world was shaped by violence and struggle. Genesis 1 offered a radically different vision. It told the Israelites that despite what the Babylonians believed, their God was still in control, even in the heart of Babylon. They think about how empowering that would have been. They're in exile. Their temple has been destroyed, their land taken, and it looks like the gods of Babylon have won. But Genesis 1 is saying no. The God who created everything, who spoke the world into order, he's still on the throne. So it wasn't just a comforting message, it was a defiant declaration in the face of an oppressive empire. Genesis 1 was their way of saying, our God doesn't play by the rules of your myths. He's beyond your gods. He doesn't need violence to rule the world. He speaks and the world listens. And it's not just the content of the creation story that's radical. The very structure of Genesis 1, with its repeated refrain of "and graced is one. It was good as it could," reflects a moral universe. In contrast to the violence and chaos of Babylonian myths, Genesis presents creation as inherently good, designed with purpose and care. There's no cosmic accident here, no divine battle scars in the fabric of the universe. It's all intentional, all ordered, and all good. Now fast forward to the time when these stories are being told to the exiled Israelites. Genesis 1 isn't just theology, it's resistance literature. It's pushing back against the Babylonian narrative. It's saying, we know what you think happened. We've heard your stories, but we're telling a different story, one where our God, the true God, speaks order into chaos without lifting a finger, without spilling a drop of blood. This is the heartbeat of Genesis 1, a peaceful, sovereign God who creates not through struggle, but through his word alone. There's one more piece we need to look at to bring all of this together, and it's probably the most overlooked part of the creation narrative, the relationship between Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. These two chapters tell different stories about creation, and that difference, it's huge. A lot of people read Genesis 1 and 2 as one continuous story, like the Bible is giving us a part 1 and part 2 of creation. But when you actually dig into the text, you realize these are two separate accounts. Genesis 1 tells the story we've been breaking down, God creating the cosmos in 6 days, speaking everything into existence, and resting on the seventh day. But then, in Genesis 2, the tone and style shift. It's no longer about God creating the universe in a cosmic structured way. Instead, it zooms in and gets really personal. Here we see God forming Adam out of the dust of the earth and breathing life into breathe. There's no mention of days, no systematic separation of light from darkness, no let there be this or that. In fact, the order of events is totally different. In Genesis 1, humans are created last, on day 6, after the animals. But in Genesis 2, Adam is created first, before any plants or animals exist. Then God creates the Garden of Eden and brings all the animals to Adam to see what he would name them. Afterward, he creates Eve from Adam's rib. So if you're reading these two accounts back to back, you've got two creation stories that seem to be in direct contradiction. What's going on? This isn't some editorial mistake. These two stories serve different purposes. Genesis 1 is all about the big picture, God creating order and function in the universe. It's cosmic, broad, and focuses on how everything fits together. Genesis 2, on the other hand, is about relationship. It's personal. It zooms in on the creation of humanity and the intimacy between God and his creation. In Genesis 2, God isn't just speaking things into existence. He's getting his hands dirty, literally shaping Adam from the dust and breathing life into him. The focus shifts from universal order to the deep connection between humans and their creator. Now let's be clear, this doesn't mean these two stories are at odds with each other. They're meant to complement each other, offering two different perspectives on creation. One is about the macro, the other about the micro. Genesis 1 gives us a God who speaks the cosmos into being with ultimate authority. Genesis 2 gives us a God who kneels in the dirt, crafting humans with care and tenderness. Together, they paint a fuller picture of who God is, both transcendent and immanent, both cosmic ruler and personal creator. But the fact that these stories differ in detail has sparked some serious debates. Over the centuries, scholars have proposed that these two accounts likely come from different sources. Genesis 1 is thought to come from what scholars call the priestly source, or P source, which focuses on order, structure, and the rituals that define Israel's relationship with God. Genesis 2 is attributed to the Yahweh source or J source, which emphasizes the personal, relational aspects of God's interaction with humanity. So what we're seeing in these two chapters isn't a contradiction, it's two distinct theological traditions woven together to give us a richer understanding of God and creation. What's also fascinating is how Genesis 2 shifts the narrative toward human responsibility. In Genesis 1, humanity's role is to be fruitful and multiply, and to have dominion over the earth. But in Genesis 2, Adam is placed in the Garden of Eden to work it and take care of it. This is a more intimate, hands-on responsibility. Humanity isn't just ruling over creation from a distance, we're deeply embedded in it. We're part of the earth, formed from its dust, and we're called to steward it. This brings us to a key takeaway. These two creation stories together tell us that the world isn't just a cosmic order we inhabit, it's a relationship we're meant to nurture. We're not just here to take from creation, but to care for it, to tend to it, to partner with God in keeping it alive and flourishing. That's a powerful message, especially for a world that often treats creation as something to be exploited rather than cherished. And so, as we wrap up this deep dive into Genesis 1-2 and beyond, we see that the Bible offers a vision of creation that's far more complex, far more meaningful than what we might have been taught. It's not just about how the world was made, it's about why it was made and who we are within it. It's about a God who orders the cosmos, brings purpose to chaos, and forms humanity with his own hands, calling us into relationship with him and with the world he's made. Thank you for sticking with us through this journey. If this video brought you new insights, if it made you think about the creation story in a different way, hit that like button. Leave a comment down below. We'd love to hear your thoughts. And don't forget to subscribe to stay tuned for more deep dives like this one. And as always, God bless you all. See you in the next video.